As far as Sherlock Holmes affecting history, I mean, we see that he had an impact on the crime fighting world because Doyle really was a pioneer in a lot of those ways. A lot of things that he put in these stories were things that would become major practice for crime fighters later on.
Do you ever wonder why an author writes what they write? What does this book mean? Why does this character act that way? And why does any of this stuff even matter? Hello, readers, and welcome back to another episode of In the Books, where we discuss our favorite works of literature from a historical perspective. Today, I'm here with Rachel, a fellow English major at my university, who's here to talk about one of her favorite literary figures. Rachel, glad to have you on the show.
It's good to be here, Audrey.
So tell me who we're discussing today.
Today we are talking about one of my favorite literary characters, Sherlock Holmes, and his creator, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Fascinating. How many of the Sherlock stories have you read?
I've read all of them multiple times.
That's impressive.
It's a lot.
So which story do you think is your favorite?
It's hard to say, honestly. I mean, there are some of the classics, like The Speckled Band and The Hound of the Baskervilles, that are really just too good to leave out. They're classic stories. They are what people think of when they think of Sherlock Holmes. Probably my favorite one is The Dying Detective. It's one of his later stories, and not a lot of people know about it. But I really like that one because it showcases Holmes using his skills in a very different way than he usually does. And it also shows how far Holmes was willing to go to trap a criminal. And that one it's really fascinating.
What are some interesting things you can tell me about the author?
Oh boy. Doyle was a man of many talents. So he was a physician first and foremost, much like Dr. Watson would be. He served as a ship's doctor on multiple ships, most of them whaling vessels. But he was really rather well traveled. He sailed to West Africa, the Caribbean, and he actually joined a crew on their expedition to the Arctic at one point.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, that one's fascinating to me. So when the Boer War broke out, Doyle left for the front lines as an army surgeon, much like Dr. Watson would be. And this is where he really started to write more frequently. He wrote some medical stuff before, but he started putting out works in support of the Boer War, like propaganda almost, as well as some fiction, including science fiction and war novels. And these were his favorites, personally, of what he'd written. Those are the things that he wanted to be known for. So later in his life, especially after the death of his wife and the death of his first son, Doyle started exploring spiritualism, which is really a vague term for just anything you can think of. He would go to seances. He believed in fairies. He thought that his children's nanny was psychic. He wrote tons of stuff about it. He spoke at conferences. He poured money into the Society for Psychical Research.
Oh wow.
It kind of ruined his reputation a little bit because he endorsed the Cottingley fairies photographs, which was like a huge scandal that happened where two girls presented photographs of them with fairies as real. And so Conan Doyle fell for it, and he started promoting this and endorsing it. And when it came out that it was fake, his credibility just kind of crashed. He actually created his own hoax later on, involving a counterfeit hominid fossil, which was later exposed. In his later years, he kind of lost his credibility a little bit, which is sad. But he did a lot of things. To list a few, he was an architect, he solved crimes, he was a Freemason, he stood for Parliament, he was involved in overthrowing the government of the Congo.
Oh.
That's an interesting story. And he judged for the world's first major bodybuilding competition.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So he sounds like a very well-rounded individual.
He really was, and there's more. There's definitely more. I don't have it all here, but there was definitely a lot more that he did in his lifetime.
Right. So I know that he started off with like medicine. What made him decide to switch careers? Was it just because he found out that writing was more profitable, or he just lost interest in medicine?
So he didn't really lose interest in medicine. He was just very poor. When he came back from the Boer War, he tried to set up a medical practice in the heart of London, where there were already like 1 million medical practices, and he could not get patients. He was losing money fast. So he started writing. He'd already written some things like he had during the war.
Right.
So he jumped back into fiction writing to just make money. So he created Sherlock Holmes and submitted his first story A Study in Scarlet, and it failed to gain publication several times until one company kind of gave him a chance, and Sherlock Holmes just took off from there. And so he actually ended up making more money from Sherlock than he did as a physician.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think influenced his writing the Sherlock stories? I think there was a specific person that he modeled Sherlock on. Is that correct?
There was. So his university teacher, Joseph Bell, was kind of who he modeled Holmes after. Physically, the way he describes the way Holmes looks is a lot like Dr. Bell. But as Bell taught in the medical field, Doyle watched him use deduction, inference, observation to diagnose patients, and he saw the implications that those kinds of methods could have in the criminal justice world. So when he created Sherlock Holmes, he kind of turned him into a parody of Joseph Bell.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So did the inspiration ever find out that he has a character now made after him?
I don't know. I don't know if he ever knew about it. I'm sure he did. There were other like mutual friends, even famous mutual friends, who read Doyle's stories about Holmes and were like, this sounds an awful lot like Joseph Bell. So I'm sure someone told him at some point, but I'm not sure how that worked out.
Imagine just writing a story, modeling it after one of our university professors.
That'd be fun, actually. That'd be really fun.
Your college friends be like, oh, this reminds me of Dr. Stone. So.
Wait a second.
It'd be so funny. So then I read somewhere that Doyle did some sleuthing in real life. Did he solve cases like Sherlock?
He did. He did employ some of the methods that he gave Sherlock. I think he worked on more cases than this, but there are two that he's known for where they were closed cases, the men were condemned to be executed, and Doyle was actually able to dig into the investigations and exonerate both men. This is kind of a real-life story of a private detective succeeding where the police had failed, and that became a theme in Sherlock Holmes as well.
Mm-hmm. Anything specific from those stories you can share?
I'm trying to think. There have been... The first one was a lot more famous than the second one. He freed a British Indian gentleman named George Adalji. He'd been arrested for writing mysterious letters, like violent letters, and for mutilating animals and leaving the parts around London.
Oh.
And somehow he got connected to it. But Doyle looked into it and realized that Adalji wasn't to blame. Adalji wasn't even in London at the time that these things happened. And after they arrested Adalji, like when they had him in custody, these things kept going on. So Doyle dug into the case. He was able to expose the real person. I don't think any actual murders happened, but it was definitely a crime. And so he exonerated George Adalji. The second gentleman, I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but he was actually a Jewish guy. And I think it was murder for him. So Doyle was able to exonerate him as well, and he paid some of his bail to get him to go home. So Doyle really did. He had an impact on the real criminal world as well as the fictional one.
That's really fascinating. So I know later in his career, Doyle wanted to stop writing the Sherlock stories. Was there a particular reason why? Did he just want to go on to write other things?
So he was just kind of sick of Sherlock. He really only created him, I mean, like I said, for money. Mm-hmm. To him, it was just kind of sensational literature, like what we would consider subliterature,
right.
And what that time period did consider subliterature, whereas now we treat it as like great literary works, kind of like Shakespeare was. But he was just churning out stories to make money, and he didn't want to be known for Sherlock Holmes. He wanted to be known for his historical novels. Mm-hmm. So his works on the Boer War were what he loved. And he wanted people to read those, and he wanted people to know him for that. But instead, he became the man who created Sherlock Holmes, and he was just done writing about him. Here's an actual quote by Doyle. He said this: "If in 100 years I am only known as the man who invented Sherlock Holmes, then I will have considered my life a failure." And I don't know what to say to that, honestly, because I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Arthur.
Because if you say, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, everyone's going to be like, oh yeah, Sherlock.
Yep.
And he would just be rolling over in his grave. That would be so sad.
Yeah, he was just annoyed with him. He didn't want to write anymore about him.
Oh, is that why now we have that story where Sherlock falls over a waterfall?
Mm-hmm.
Was he trying to kill him off?
That's exactly what he was doing. So he finally got fed up. He thought of a great ending for Sherlock Holmes, and it really was. It's a great story and a good send-off for that character. But his one problem was that he left it open for Sherlock to survive.
Oh.
Because when when that story circulated, people were outraged. Men wore black armbands for days afterwards. like if the Queen had died or something, they were so mad that Sherlock Holmes had died. The Queen petitioned him to write more.
Queen Victoria?
I think so. She literally called him up and was like, "You gotta bring this guy back." His mom wrote him letters, "Please bring Sherlock Holmes back." He fought against it for so long. So this is a bit of a sidetrack, I guess, but interesting story. So he was done with Sherlock Holmes after that story.
Right.
After the memoirs came out, he was like, "I'm done." So he started working on other works because at that point he really wasn't a physician anymore. He'd made so much money off of Sherlock. So he started working on another story with a friend of his, collaborating together. And they came up with a great plot, but they needed a protagonist. And so, much to his chagrin, Doyle said, "Okay, fine, I will bring him back for this one story, but this is a past story. This isn't, he's not alive now. This is just something that happened in the past that Watson's writing about again." And that is how we got The Hound of the Baskervilles. Which ended up being the most famous Sherlock Holmes story ever. It wasn't long after that he ended up bringing Holmes back for good.
The legacy just
He couldn't die. He couldn't do it.
Poor guy, though.
I know. He was shackled.
Right, historical novels, and everyone's like, "No, Sherlock."
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a mood. So, I know that before Sherlock, there were some mystery stories, but it wasn't a huge thing. And now we have mystery stories galore. So, did Doyle really influence?
He did. He really set the bar for what a good detective story needs to be. And he didn't, like you said, he didn't create the modern detective story. Mm-hmm. That's usually credited to Edgar Allan Poe, actually, and his Monsieur Dupin. That came out a little bit before Sherlock Holmes came out.
Right, and I know Poe isn't best known for detective things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Poe explored a lot of different kinds of stories.
So I think that's probably why Doyle gets more recognition, because that was his big thing, whereas Poe was more of his poetry and his scary stories. Yeah,
we've all heard of the Purloined Letter that Poe wrote. Mm-hmm. But that's just kind of lumped in with all the rest of his short stories.
Right.
Whereas Sherlock Holmes became such a sensation, it boomed so large in the literary community that it really, like I said, it set the bar for future detective writers.
Set the bar rather high.
Very high, yeah. I mean, there's a reason why today people are still making movies about Sherlock Holmes and TV shows and parodies and adaptations and even fan fiction. Right. There are famous authors who write fan fiction or have written fan fiction about Sherlock Holmes, including Neil Gaiman, H.P. Lovecraft, C.S. Lewis. They all wrote stuff about Sherlock Holmes. So there's a reason that Sherlock Holmes has absolutely dominated society within the last century, especially now, because as of this year, as of January 1st, the very last Sherlock Holmes story passed into public domain. So no more lawsuits. Now people can write anything they want about Sherlock Holmes.
That's great. Why do you think people are drawn to the Sherlock stories? What do they connect with?
I think a big pull as far as connection goes is Dr. Watson. He's kind of the normal guy pitted against Sherlock Holmes' abnormal person. Yeah, like the everyman. And while we know, people who've read Sherlock Holmes know that Watson is a great character in his own right. Mm-hmm. His awe of Sherlock Holmes, especially early on, is something that everybody's feeling. They watch him work and they're like, wow, how do you do that? And kind of the reader identifying with Watson as they both watch Sherlock Holmes work, I think is a huge pull. That and the fantastic. People like seeing things that are abnormal or interesting. I mean, that's why we read about stuff that's not real, because we want to see what it's like. I think another part of it, too, is everything that Sherlock Holmes does could happen. Mm-hmm. All of the methods that he employs. Conan Doyle actually invented fingerprinting.
Oh.
He put it in a study in Scarlet. Holmes was studying ways to use fingerprints to solve crimes. And about 5 years after that came out is when the law enforcement started fingerprinting. So they read the story and were like, oh, that's a good idea. Everything that he does is viable. You see all his reasoning and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
So there's a realistic element.
Yeah,
it draws people in because they can see it happening in real life.
Yeah, because there are some detective stories you watch it and you're like, that could never happen, or there's no way they figured that out. But you watch Sherlock do it and you're like, oh yeah. I think additionally, just from a literary standpoint, a good character can save almost any story. If you have good characters and good character development, you can give them any plot and people will be interested because they want to see that person in any circumstance. And I think Sherlock Holmes as a character is so fleshed out and so well developed and so uniquely himself. And in every story you find out something new about him. And I know for me, that was a huge pull, is just him as a character was so fascinating.
I know he's kind of a fictional crush when I was like in young high school.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, he's just so smart and just so put together, just so cool. Like, I don't know, teenage me always went for the guys with all the charisma and just were like just cool vibes.
No, I went for the guys with the brains. I was like, man, he's so smart. He can do like anything.
Right, and he just walked into a room and just immediately like it's like he knows everything.
Just bam, 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 mystery solved.
Right. I wonder if there's something about Sherlock that everybody wants for the to see in themselves. Like they want, to be a hero. They want to just, be the smart person and be able to come up with a way to save the day.
I know for me and for my brother too, we're both huge Sherlock Holmes fans, and it's really developed my observational skills. I started like as a high schooler reading these, and I was like, man, I want to be like that. I want to be able to see the things he does and do the things he does. And so I kind of started noticing things on purpose, just to see if I could, like, I'd see somebody and go, I wonder what such and such feature says about them. I wonder what this says about them. And it really did help me a lot with my observation skills, because I'm not a naturally observant person. So there are things now that I notice about people, or that I notice in situations, that I know I got from reading Sherlock Holmes. And I think a part of that was wanting to be like him, like you said, wanting to have those skills for yourself.
Interesting. Is there anything more from like the history part that you want to share? I know that in the books we like to talk about history a lot along with the literature, because I had a professor my freshman year who taught me that history and literature, they're basically like soulmates. They're so intertwined throughout the ages, because history influences literature, and literature in turn sometimes influences history.
I mean, the history definitely did influence the stories of Sherlock Holmes. I mean, Doyle's personal history did. Watson is kind of a self-insert character for him, because he was an army surgeon.
Right.
He did a lot of the same things that Watson does in the stories. I don't know if Doyle was ever injured. We see Doyle's own life, which was affected by history. I mean, he went to war. He traveled on these ships. A lot of the adventures that Holmes and Watson have reflect the culture around them. Like, there really was a rise in crime during these eras. This is around the same time as Jack the Ripper.
Oh, yeah.
And so there was an interest in solving these mysterious crimes. And I think the war definitely had an impact because of the character of Watson and everything that he had been through and all of the training that he had received as an army surgeon. But one thing I do appreciate about Sherlock Holmes is that it's set in this time and it uses the elements of it, but it's not limited to it.
Right. There is a timeless aspect.
There is. And it's able to be its own thing without relying on the historicity of it. As far as Sherlock Holmes affecting history, I mean, we see that he had an impact on the crime-fighting world, because Doyle really was a pioneer in a lot of those ways, with the fingerprinting, like I said, some of the analysis of blood and stuff like that, and like ballistics, like a lot of things that he put in these stories were things that would become major practice for crime fighters later on. And so he was kind of a pioneer in a lot of those respects. And so I think that he did have an impact on history as far as criminal justice goes, but who knows how long it would have taken them to come up with some of these things if it hadn't been for Doyle. And obviously the literary impact of Sherlock Holmes is also immense. So
I know there have been a lot of film adaptations of Sherlock Holmes. Have you seen a lot of those films?
I have, yes. I've seen a number of them.
So out of all those films, is there one in particular that you think just so well captures the true essence of Sherlock and how Doyle wanted him portrayed?
So I think multiple actors who portrayed Sherlock Holmes have emphasized different aspects of him really well. I don't know if there's one that's like the perfect Sherlock Holmes. I think probably the closest we got was with Basil Rathbone. He was the first actor to really be known for playing Sherlock Holmes. And he looked the part. He looked just like he's described in the books. He got down pat. The way of analyzing, the stoicness of him, he really encapsulated just a very kind of cold and calculating. I'd say the one drawback to his was honestly his Watson. Nothing but love to Nigel Bruce. But he just wasn't a good cast as Watson. He kind of perpetrated the stigma of Watson being kind of a bumbling old man who was kind of stupid and who Sherlock had to drag around everywhere with him.
Right.
Book Watson is not like that at all.
Right,
he is very much intelligent in his own right. He is a very capable young man. They're like the same age. And several times in the stories, he contributes significantly to the investigations. And also, I think another drawback of his Holmes is that there is a warmth to Holmes in the books that often gets missed because people focus on the cold, calculating, like no emotions, I hate women kind of guy.
Yeah, but he was human too.
Exactly. He was human too. There are times in the books where he's shaken, he's fearful. There are times where he is angry. There are times where he really cares about Watson as his friend and wants to help people. So I think that that's probably the one thing that Rathbone's Sherlock was missing, except that he does help people. But of course, what everyone has in mind when they think of Sherlock Holmes nowadays is Benedict Cumberbatch.
Right.
And I think he did a phenomenal job as Sherlock Holmes. I really did. So with his Sherlock Holmes, they focused more on an adaptation of Sherlock Holmes rather than I mean, they said it in modern times.
Right.
So it wasn't like an exact replica.
It's more inspired.
And they put a spin on Sherlock Holmes. He actually portrayed him as an autistic person, which is really cool.
Yeah.
And it works. Yeah, it definitely works with the character. I don't think that that's how Book Holmes was written.
Right.
But I think that the show did it really well. Especially showing that emotional side of him caring for his friends and family.
Right.
One thing that his Holmes does wrong is that he snaps at people really easily. He gets really frustrated and angry at people when they're being stupid.
Yeah.
Which we really don't see Book Holmes doing. Even though he's very cold and calculated, he's very polite.
Right.
If a lady comes in and is crying on his couch because she can't find her husband or something, he's very respectful and chivalrous. And he takes care of her. He might be a little bit detached from his emotions, but he's not at all like, oh, stop crying, you big lousy person. But I think he missed kind of that politeness that Holmes was really known for. I don't think I need to talk about Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes. I don't know. I liked the movie. I don't know what he was doing.
I need to watch more movies and TV. I honestly haven't watched a ton of TV.
So probably my favorite, I wouldn't say he's the best, but probably my favorite was Ron Howard's Sherlock Holmes, not the Ron Howard from Happy Days. This was a previous Ron Howard. They made a show, they actually made it in France. I think it was made by like a French company, but they made a show called The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, old show from like the 50s. But I loved it. He did an amazing Sherlock Holmes. He had the politeness, he had the kindness and the caring about people. He was very brilliant, obviously. He basically had everything. The one thing that he did wrong is that he was a little inept sometimes at like fighting. So the way that they depicted them, and I love their duo. I love his Watson. H. Marion Crawford is the best Watson, if you ask me. Holmes was the brain, Watson was the brawn. And in the books, Holmes is very much capable of defending himself. He was a single stick fighter. He was a boxer. He is a force to be reckoned with, physically speaking. And that is one thing that Ron Howard's Sherlock Holmes didn't really include. There's one, and it's meant to be funny, but there's one episode where Watson's teaching Holmes how to punch people, and Holmes can't do it because he punches him and knocks him out, but then he's like, oh, my hand hurts. And so Watson teaches him how to do it without hurting his hand. So he's a little bit inept physically. But that's really the only fault I can find with him. So you asked about some of his other works. So he did write some novels before Sherlock Holmes, mostly historical stuff, mostly short stories. Some stuff was inspired by his time at sea. So they're like set on ships and stuff like that. He created the scientist Professor Challenger, and he wrote 9 novels and 5 shorter stories on him. He created the French character, the Brigadier General, which is a collection of short stories set in Napoleonic times. And that's probably, as far as characters go, that's probably his second most famous character that he's created, other than Sherlock and Watson. He's really known for The Lost World, which was a Challenger story, and that actually did have a pretty decent impact on the times. It's just not nearly as well known as Sherlock Holmes. It's kind of dystopian, a little bit, which was kind of before his time.
Right, because I know there's more dystopian in the 20th
Mhm.
century, but not really much in the 19th.
Yeah, so that was kind of a forerunner. I don't think it had much impact on later dystopian works, but it was definitely an early one that did have a decent impact.
So for today's episode, we heard from Rachel about Sherlock Holmes and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. We heard a little bit about Doyle's history and some things that he wrote. Of course, a lot about Sherlock himself, and then just how Doyle was able to influence the literary world and the crime-fighting world, interestingly enough. So thank you for joining us on another episode of In the Books, where we discussed Sherlock Holmes, which is now in the books.